Chapter 17. German Verlagsrecht and the Personality Interest. 1. Martin Luther's 1525 warning against pirate printers. Long before the German states unified into a singular empire, the great theft of intellectual labor found its first and thunderous critic in the heart of the Reformation, Martin Luther. In the early 16th century, the printing press was the primary engine of Luther's religious revolution, turning his manuscripts into thousands of pamphlets that flooded the Holy Roman Empire. However, by 1525, Luther realized that the divine art of printing had a dark shadow. He looked upon the bookstalls of Wittenberg and Leipzig and saw his own words being butchered, stolen, and sold by literary highwaymen. In response, he published a scathing, visceral protest titled Warning to Printers, Admonition to the Printers. This wasn't a dry legal brief, it was a scream of moral outrage that would echo for centuries. Luther's grievance wasn't rooted in a desire for royalties — he famously refused to accept payment for his spiritual works — but in the sanctity of the message. He described with biting detail the predatory nature of printers who would wait in the shadows for his finalized manuscripts, only to rush them through their own low-quality presses before the original publisher could even finish the first batch. Luther painted a vivid picture of these pirate editions. They were riddled with errors, omissions, unauthorized corrections that distorted his theology. To Luther, these printers weren't just stealing silver. They were stealing his voice and corrupting the Word of God for which he was willing to die. He argued that the printer's profit from such theft was blood money taken from the labor of others, but more importantly, he introduced the embryonic, revolutionary idea of the personality interest. He portrayed the relationship between the author and the book as an organic, spiritual bond. For Luther, the fence of protection was necessary not just to safeguard a market, but to protect the integrity of the soul's expression. He was the first to suggest that even if the physical object, the paper and ink, was sold, the inner word, the unique spirit of the creator, remained the perpetual property of the author. This moral outrage laid the absolute foundation for the uniquely German concept of Urheberrecht. It transformed the great theft from a mere commercial crime into a spiritual violation, suggesting that property is an extension of the human personality, a moral fence that no amount of gold could ever fully dismantle. 2. Johann Stephan Putter's True Principles of Law. As the 18th century dawned, the German legal mind, obsessed with order, categorization, and the scientific rigor of the Aufklärung, the Enlightenment, sought to turn Luther's moral outrage into a rigid, interlocking system of law. The man who provided the architectural blueprint for this new enclosure was Johann Stephan Putter, a towering jurist of the Göttingen school. In his 1774 work, Der Bücher nach Druck nach echten Grundsätzen des Rechts, Book Piracy According to the True Principles of Law, Putter performed a conceptual surgery that would change the nature of property forever. Putter's central genius was the dismantling of the physicality trap. He argued that a book wasn't a single entity, like a chair, a plow, or a parcel of land. Instead, he bifurcated the book into two distinct realities. First, there was the corpus mechanicum, the physical body of the book, made of paper, leather, and ink. This, he admitted, could be owned by anyone who bought it. But then he revealed the invisible ghost, the corpus mysticum, the intellectual essence, the intangible body of the work that remained forever tethered to the creator. This was a masterful expansion of the great theft. Putter proposed that the fence should not just surround the physical object, but the invisible energy of the creative act. He argued that when an author writes, they're not merely assembling words, they're performing a unique personal act that cannot be separated from their identity. Therefore, the pirate printer who copied a book wasn't just making a thing, he was usurping the personhood of the author. By defining authorship as a perpetual doing rather than a finished having, Putter ensured that the law followed the person, not the paper. He turned the publishing contract from a simple bill of sale into a lease of a human spirit. In Putter's landscape, the author became a perpetual landlord of their own thoughts, and the great theft was redefined as a crime of imitation. This paved the way for the German legal tradition to view property as something innate, a spiritual territory that the state didn't create but was merely obligated to protect with a sword. 3. Kant and Fichte, the trap of content and form. The philosophical weight of German idealism was eventually brought to bear on the question of property by the giants of the era, Immanuel Kant and Johann Gottlieb Fichte. They faced a nagging paradox that threatened the entire Enlightenment. If ideas are the common property of all mankind, the commons of reason, how can a book be locked behind a private fence without committing a crime against humanity? Their solution was a brilliant yet dangerous conceptual trap, the division between content and form. Kant, in his 1785 essay on the injustice of counterfeiting books, argued that a book is fundamentally a speech to the public, reala oratio. Since you cannot own the air through which a voice travels, you cannot own the content or the ideas within a book. Those are common property. However, Kant argued that the publisher acts as the author's proxy, a specialized messenger. To copy a book without permission was like hijacking a messenger on the road. It was a violation of the contract of speech. Fichte took this even further, creating a hierarchy of ownership. He divided a book into 3 parts. First, the physical object, owned by the buyer. Second, the content, the ideas, owned by everyone, the public domain. Third, the form, the specific way the author has woven their thoughts together. Fichte declared that the form was the inseparable, unique property of the author's spirit. You could take the ideas from a book, but if you took the form, you were stealing the author's soul. This was the ultimate abstraction of the great theft. It created a world where the fence was invisible, woven into the very syntax, rhythm, and style of the text. It allowed the state to claim it was protecting universal reason, while simultaneously building an impenetrable legal fortress around the way that reason was expressed. The great theft had moved from the land to the book, and finally into the very architecture of human language. 4. The Prussian Statute Book of 1794 and Publishing Contracts. The ethereal, high-minded musings of Kant and Putter found their cold administrative reality in the Prussian General State Laws of 1794. Allgemeines Landrecht. This massive 19,000-paragraph code was the first of its kind to treat publishing contracts, Verlagsrecht, not merely as a commercial exchange of goods, but as a specialized field of property law regulated by the state. It was the moment the great theft was institutionalized by the most efficient and disciplined bureaucracy in Europe. The Prussian statute book treated the author and the publisher as 2 halves of a single state-sanctioned economic machine. In its precision, the law codified the personality interest by ensuring that a publisher was legally prohibited from altering an author's work without explicit consent. However, it simultaneously solidified the fence by making publishing rights highly enforceable through the power of the Prussian courts. The contract became the new boundary marker, replacing the old erratic royal privileges with a standardized, predictable legal instrument. In this landscape, the writer was transformed from a gentleman amateur or a starving poet into a functional legal entity with a defined set of rights and obligations. The law recognized that the author's spirit was present in the book, but it ensured that the commercial exploitation of that spirit followed rigid, state-mandated rules. The 18th century common of the German mind was now subdivided into thousands of individual contracts. The 1794 statute ensured that in the Kingdom of Prussia, the great theft was no longer a chaotic brawl between printers. It was a disciplined, orderly transfer of value, where the right to thought was meticulously filed, stamped, and policed by the iron hand of the state. 5. Bluntschli's 4 stages of legal perfection. We close this chapter with the Swiss-German jurist Johann Caspar Bluntschli, who in the mid-19th century looked back at the long history of property and perceived a divine teleological evolution. Bluntschli proposed that the law of intellectual ownership moved through 4 stages of perfection, each one more enclosed, more private, and supposedly more civilized than the last. He framed this progression as a natural ascent toward the peak of human legal achievement. Bluntschli's 4 stages were, first, the stage of commonality, where ideas are as free as the air, belonging to the collective heritage of the tribe, the pre-theft state. Second, the stage of privilege, where ownership is a rare gift or an act of grace bestowed upon a king or pope upon a chosen few, the Renaissance. Third, the stage of copyright, where ownership is a formal legal statute protecting the merchant's investment and the physical copy, the 18th century. Fourth, the stage of personality, where ownership is finally recognized as a fundamental human right of the spirit, inseparable from the creator's identity, the modern era. Bluntschli's 4 stages served as a grand justification for the total enclosure of human culture. He argued that as a society becomes more perfected, it must necessarily recognize more and more forms of property. To Bluntschli, the great theft wasn't a crime at all, it was the highest achievement of civilization. By turning the human personality itself into a piece of property, he argued that the law was finally giving the individual their ultimate due. This marked the final victory of the property concept, the moment when the fence was no longer seen as a restriction on the public, but as the ultimate crown of human dignity. The enclosure was complete. The mind had been turned into a private garden, and the law stood at the gate as its permanent guardian.